Welcome to week 8 of evidence. This week we will cover the topic of judicial notice. We'll cover the cases from your casebook from pages 727 to 744. The first case that we covered is De La Cruz v. City of Los Angeles. This is a California Court of Appeals case for the 2nd District from 2004. As background, this was a personal injury action arising out of a hit-and-run accident caused by a police officer's negligent driving. The police officer committed suicide the day after the accident. The officer was last seen attending a colleague's retirement party, and the accident then occurred on the officer's way home. The plaintiff's theory at trial was this party was a special errand for the officer's employer, and so that the officer was technically on duty when this accident occurred. The issue was whether the judgment for non-suit against the plaintiff on the issue of if the officer was acting within his scope of employment was procedurally defective. This court held that, yes, the judgment for non-suit was defective. It held that the plaintiff's evidence, although weak, was enough to withstand a non-suit. The court took judicial notice that the accident occurred in the neighborhood of the police station and that the street where the accident happened was on a route that led to the officer's home. The next case is Fielding v. State. This is a Court of Appeals of Alaska case from 1992. As background, the defendant was convicted of driving on a highway or vehicular way or area with a suspended license. The defendant contended he only drove in a parking lot. The trial court held that a parking lot was not a vehicular way. The plaintiff then claimed that the defendant drove from that parking lot to a road called Glen Highway. At trial, the judge instructed the jury that Glen Highway is a highway as used in the statute, which was what defendant was being charged with. The defendant claimed that this jury instruction was essentially a directed verdict against him, meaning that the jury would have to convict him because the judge was instructing them that Glen Highway was a highway and he's being charged with driving on a highway without a suspended license. At issue was, did the trial court err in giving this jury instruction? The appeals court held that the trial court's jury instruction did amount to a directed verdict, and that the jury should have been instructed that it may, but was not required to, accept the judicially noticed fact as conclusively established, which was here that Glen Highway was a highway. The court found that this error was not harmless because the jury instruction deprived the defendant of his right to have the jury decide every element of the charge and then was per se prejudicial. We'll have casebook hypos 1 through 3 on page 742, which we'll discuss as a class. Our final case is United States v. Amado Nunez. This is a United States Court of Appeals case for the First Circuit from 2004. As background, the defendant was convicted of transporting counterfeit stamps in foreign commerce. The stamps were found at a customs screening at the International Airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico. The indictment charged that the defendant had arrived on a flight from the Dominican Republic, but at trial, the plaintiff had forgot to actually prove this point. At issue was whether that without direct evidence that defendant was traveling internationally, could the jury have concluded beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was flying from a foreign point. This court held that this missing link, that the defendant was traveling internationally, was so familiar to the jury and so clearly true that it could have taken judicial notice of it if necessary, but that it was not necessary. The court felt that jurors are not expected to come to court as blank slates. They have knowledge of the world, like how if you are arriving in customs, that means you were flying internationally, as domestic flyers do not need to go through customs. And so essentially, the prosecution did not need to prove this point, since the jury could make that assumption based on their own knowledge of the world.